Welcome to the Business is Good podcast with Chris Young, president of the Good Place Institute, helping leaders build and steward thriving organizations where people flourish, communities prosper, and the organization is economically regenerative. And I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg. You know, the world rises and falls on leadership. What makes a good leader? Better yet, what makes a great leader? Is it charisma or fantastic oral capability? Or is it a huge helping of humility? Whatever it is, where do you find a formula for making this happen? Today's conversation is focused on developing a kingdom-minded leader and the impact that makes on everybody in the organization, from investors, employees, vendors, and ultimately to customers. Chris, let's talk leadership today. What's your definition of a kingdom-minded leader?
Yeah, very simple definition for us at Good Place, Jim, is a leader is one who stewards and serves. And that might go against, some definitions are leaders of influence or things of that nature, and that might not be a bad thing, but that's really it at a Good Place organization, at a kingdom-minded organization. You steward, you serve, you sacrifice, and you serve a greater purpose than yourself.
I think that'd be a great topic for a future podcast. Talk the difference between stewardship, ownership kind of thing. So,
yes.
So what is the biggest shift then that a leader needs to make to lead a Good Place organization?
You said the first word in your intro. I think it starts with humility. So if we look in the Bible and we look at Jesus's most famous speech, if you're at church, you might call it the Sermon on the Mount. Right out of the gate, he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who have humility." Obviously, before a holy God, for sure, but also before each other. It starts with humility. And I'll bring in another concept that we talked about in an earlier episode, the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's a person, a leader who genuinely, one, is honest with themselves, but two, wants God's kingdom to come and doesn't just want God to bless their kingdom, but really is pursuing the kingdom of God.
That kingdom-minded leader mindset, that's something a lot of people don't hear about at church, this whole kingdom idea. Yet Jesus talked more about the kingdom than he did about the church. So when we're talking about being a kingdom-minded leader, don't we need to understand what's the kingdom, Chris?
We do. This is a great question, Jim, because often when I talk with clients or even internally here at the holdings company, we talk about God being a really good employer. So I could just go there for just a minute.
Okay.
God is an employer. If he was a really good employer, he would never give you a job without a job description, right?
Makes sense.
And so this kind of leads to your question. One of our jobs, if we're followers of Jesus, is to, do the co-labor with God to bring about his kingdom, co-labor or cooperate with each other because we're co-heirs with Christ. So these co-labor, cooperate to bring about more of his kingdom, we do. What does his kingdom look like? And what's the quote-unquote blueprint for this kingdom house that we're supposed to co-labor and cooperate with each other to help build? It's essential. We have to understand, what are those characteristics of God's kingdom, especially if you're leading a business, because really that's ultimate in Good Place organizations is we desire to give more and more people opportunity to experience characteristics of God's kingdom at work and therefore experience the King himself.
I think it's important. I watch a lot of movies. I watch, a lot of medieval movies or movies with kings and princes and queens and that kind of stuff. And it's good to understand, since we serve a king, we need to understand that we serve at the pleasure of the king. And that really puts things in perspective, doesn't it, Chris?
It does. Go ahead. One of the things I love to talk about. Oh, sorry, I was jumping in there on you.
Go ahead.
Like I usually do. But in Luke 10 in the Bible, in Luke chapter 10, where Jesus sends out 70 or 72, depending on your translation, and the story is phenomenal. He sends out his disciples, and they're to go into towns and villages, and if they find a person of peace, they stay there. and they have the opportunity to interact with individuals to teach and train and model what the kingdom looks like, right? They get to cast out demons and heal people. And he said, tell them the kingdom of heaven just came near you. And if the opposite happens, if you enter that town or village and you don't find a person of peace, this is the infamous phrase of, knock the dust off your sandals, but tell them the kingdom of heaven just came near you. So it does beg your question, what is this kingdom of heaven? Anywhere that Jesus is king and anywhere where life the way he intends it is being lived out.
That's a good word. If you want to find out more about becoming a good place leader, check us out online at goodplaceinstitute.com. So how do good place leaders, kingdom-minded leaders, how do you guys help them balance humility along with authority and responsibility? Because those seem, in the world's eyes, humility and authority seem to like those are contrary, even though we're saying today that they're not. So how do you help leaders balance that humility, authority, and responsibility?
Yeah, another great question. And I think it comes into the word stewardship. And you and I have both sat around, leadership team meetings where we would say something, or you've heard something like, wow, I really wish somebody would take more ownership of that area, right? And we know what that means. They should work harder or take on more responsibility or et cetera, et cetera. We think there's something greater than ownership here, Jim. And this probably is a good fodder for another episode, but it's this idea of stewardship, to understand what God has entrusted to us, especially in an organizational business setting. Certainly there's people involved, image bearers of the creator of the universe. There's assets involved. There's time, opportunity, talent, treasure, facilities, customers you mentioned earlier. Understanding what all of those things are that God has entrusted to us in order for us to bring a kingdom return, or if you're talking plain glass language, to make it better, to make it look more like the kingdom. And that starts with humility. So having this stewardship versus ownership mindset is extremely important.
So, but how does humility cause us to be a better leader? Because sometimes when you're being humble, it means you're going to admit your mistakes, and leaders can't admit that they're making mistakes. I mean, how does humility lead to greater authority?
Yeah, and when we look at other leaders, and we do this at Good Place, we look at leaders even outside the kingdom, and you come up with this good list. Humility is one of them. Transparency is another one. Authentic relationships, being competent in your role, investing in people to make them something, greater than themselves. That's like a good coach. These are all characteristics of a leader that starts with this idea that other people are more important than I am, and also this idea of humility that the purpose of the organization is greater than myself and greater than any one person.
So these three critical things you're talking about, the humility, authority, and responsibility, those really embody a different kind of leader than we're used to, don't they?
It really does. And you say those three words in understanding where the authority comes from. And again, this maybe sounds very simplistic and cliche. At the Good Place Holdings Organization, we're a taxable nonprofit, so therefore we have no owners. And so the board, which is a policy governance board, they represent the moral owner, which is the triune God of the Bible, and represent the owner as the board. And so this idea that owner gives you the authority to steward the things that he's entrusted you with. It is a different mindset because we think we own stuff and we think we control things. And reality is we both know that both of those are fallacies.
Yeah, but sometimes it's fun to live in a fantasy world though, Chris. Sure. And there may be a lot of people going, there's a lot going on here in this conversation. I need to find out more. Check us out at goodplaceinstitute.com. We'd love to have a conversation with you. Chris, let's end the podcast today with this question, because this is so important, because we're talking about making the places that we lead a good place to work. Mm-hmm. What happens to the culture of an organization, whether it's a business or a nonprofit, whatever it may be, could be a hospital. What happens to the culture when a leader starts living out his or her leadership with humility and authority and responsibility? What happens to that culture?
And if you don't mind, I'm going to add that word stewardship in there.
Okay.
Because what kind of culture ends up taking place, and we'll unpack this a little bit more as we get more and more into the Good Place operating system, because the operating system actually helps espouse this kind of culture. And the kind of culture starts to look like characteristics of his kingdom. It's a culture of learning. It's a culture of lifelong learning. It's a culture of being a safe space physically, emotionally, psychologically. It's a culture of critical thinking, of problem solving, of being able to share ideas. It's a culture of not just monitoring data, but actually learning why that data is being produced and how to improve it. So we call that actually a stewardship cycle. So these are cultural characteristics of an organization where people can flourish and thrive. It's a culture of training, education, developing somebody personally and professionally inside and outside the organization. When we start to think this way, that there's greater purposes here that we're responsible for, that we had stewardship over, and that we're humble enough to desire God's kingdom and not our own.
So it's a culture that everybody would want to work in, because it sounds like a place I'd like to go.
Well, who wouldn't want to work at a good place?
Well said. Well said. Wow, Chris Young, great conversation on leadership. And what does kingdom leadership really look like? I appreciate it. I can't wait till our next episode, but I love the way you succinctly put this all together. Really, it all leads out with humility, and that's a powerful, really antithetical and powerful way to look at things. Thank you, Chris Young.
Yeah, thanks, Jim.
Thanks for joining us today on the Business is Good podcast with Chris Young of the Good Place Institute. If today's conversation encouraged or challenged you, we'd love to hear about it. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube channel and share this episode. And for more resources on how to build a good place or to connect with our team, visit goodplaceinstitute.com.